my name's Helen McCarthy, and I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to tell you a little bit about a book that I've recently published called Double Lives, A History of Working Motherhood. It sets out to explore the experiences of mothers who worked for pay in Britain since about the mid-19th century to the present day. It's quite a broad-ranging book. I was keen to cast my net pretty wide and to consider the lives of women across social classes, across ethnicities, across regions, and across different kinds of workplaces and industries, asking about what sorts of jobs mothers did, how they organised childcare, what kind of discrimination or prejudice they faced from employers, from policymakers, from trade unionists and so on, and how all of this changed over time, and of course, why. So I try to pose and answer quite a lot of questions in this book. How were working mothers affected by the two world wars, for example? How did broader shifts in the economy, in the structure of labour markets, the growth of the welfare state transform the landscape of possibility for the working mother? What difference did feminism make to the rights and status of mothers in the workplace? So all of that is there in this book. And I suppose the big claim or the big argument of the book really goes something like this. Working motherhood in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was framed very much as a social and economic problem. So the wage-earning mother was a symbol of moral and domestic disorder, and she was a sign that something had gone very wrong in Britain's political economy, founded as it was on the ideal of the male breadwinner. By the later 20th century, I argue, working mothers have become ordinary. They've become a permanent feature of the social and economic landscape, and a woman's need or desire to return to work after having children is recognised as a legitimate aspiration rather than an antisocial act. So this is not a claim, I should stress, about women achieving equality by the end of the 20th century. Becoming ordinary does not equate to becoming equal in the workplace. We haven't got there yet, and it might be that the current COVID-19 crisis will set women back quite considerably from achieving that goal in the coming years. Something that I might come back to towards the end of my talk. But I do see this as a major transformation taking place across the 20th century, which needs to be accounted for. And that's what my book tries to do. And one of the key factors that I point to are women's own shifting aspirations and expectations, which begin to change, I argue, around the middle of the 20th century for a whole host of reasons. So that's Double Lives, the book. But for the rest of my talk, I thought that I would pull out just one particular strand from the book, which is to do with the history of mothers in the white-collar and professional workplace. So I'm going to start by telling you about a couple of Victorian working mothers, beginning with the civil service. So women were first employed in clerical work in central government in the 1870s, initially in the General Post Office. And this image on the left depicts post office clerks in the late 19th century. And as you can see, they're a rather genteel and respectable group of ladies. It's extremely unlikely that any of the women depicted here would have been mothers, as the civil service, like other employers of female white-collar labour, enforced a marriage bar which required women to resign when they got engaged. But the government always gave itself some wriggle room here. So if a woman's talents and expertise were particularly sought after, then exceptions could be made. And in fact, the first woman to hold any kind of position of responsibility in the civil service was a married woman and a mother, Jane Senior, who's pictured here on the right. This is a rather beautiful portrait by her friend, George Frederick Watts, the famous Victorian artist, and it reflects Jane Senior's artistic sensibilities herself. She was a singer, she was a sculptor, and an artist's muse. But her job as a civil servant was very different. She was appointed in 1873 as government inspector of workhouse schools, tasked with the inspection of the education and welfare of girls in those schools. And this was an area in which she had carried out some voluntary social work earlier in her life, and therefore she was well equipped for this job. And it involved traveling around the country, visiting institutions and producing reports for the government. Her marital and maternal status doesn't seem to have been an issue when she was appointed. This might have been due to the fact that this was a temporary appointment rather than a permanent job in the civil service. Her own son, Walter, was fully grown by this point, but Senior did still have parental responsibility for her brother's young children. And there was, in fact, a moment during her travels when she was summoned to their school in Edinburgh because they'd both come down with the measles. So Jane Senior had to drop what she was doing and travel up to Scotland to sort these children out. And she actually ended up getting her mother to take them in while they were recovering from their illness. And there's some wonderful material from Senior's letters to Walter, her own son, in which she describes how conflicted she feels between the demands of her job and this family emergency. But it's also a conflict in terms of the demands of her husband, who wants to see her at home. As he says, he writes to say that I must come home, for he so dislikes the house when I am away. So I find that I'm torn between two duties. I find that it is almost impossible to get on with my official work. One can't do it well unless one's mind is to a certain extent free. And she says this is the great drawback, I suspect, to women having work of this sort. The feminine work being the real life of a woman, she feels rightly that in cases of illness, the thing that must be put aside is the official. As it happened, Senior stood down from her position very soon after this, but because of her own failing health, rather than the needs of her family. So it was a very short-lived civil service career. Now, we find a very different example of professional working motherhood in the Victorian era in Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, whose name might be familiar to you as a pioneer woman doctor. She was the first British-trained woman to have her name appear on the medical register in 1865, and she then started practicing from her home in Marylebone, as well as founding a hospital for women and children. But what you might not know about Garrett Anderson is that she was married and the mother of 3 children. She was actually relatively old when she had her children. She was 37 when she gave birth to her oldest daughter, Louisa, who's pictured here. Her second daughter very tragically died in babyhood, and then she went on to have a son. And Garrett Anderson was very determined when she married her husband, James Anderson, in 1870, to continue her medical career. So unlike James Senior, Garrett Anderson was closely linked to the Victorian women's movement. Her sister was in fact Millicent Garrett Fawcett, the leading suffragist. And she evidently saw herself as something of a role model for women coming up behind her. But what's striking is that she never spoke or wrote publicly about the pleasures or the challenges of being a working mother. She never publicly advocated medicine as a profession which women could or should pursue alongside marriage and motherhood. And I think that this reflects the sense of insecurity which many pioneer women in the professions felt at this historical juncture. They had to step very carefully in order to avoid public censure and to deflect male prejudice. This is a moment where women's colleges are opening up for women. Women are beginning to gain entry to other universities. They're beginning to gain entry to professions like medicine, but they have to tread very, very carefully. And the other important thing to say about Garrett Anderson is that she's pretty well off. Her husband is a successful businessman. They have a very comfortable lifestyle. And like most other upper middle class families, they have lots of servants, including nursemaids and nannies who can look after the children. And this means that Elizabeth Garrett Anderson doesn't have to worry very much about the practical side of juggling career and family. And this remains largely true of professional working mothers as we move forward into the 20th century. And here we have three examples of successful working mothers from the interwar period. So in the middle, E.M. Delafield, this very striking modernist pose. She was a successful novelist and writer. She had a huge commercial success, which made her the main breadwinner, in fact, for her family. She had servants and boarding schools and governesses to draw on. She had a nice little flat in Bloomsbury, which she would retreat to for periods of time when writing her books. And writing was more generally a career which mothers could pursue more or less continuously if they had all of those resources behind them. Winifred de Kock on the left is a little different. She was South African and she trained as a psychologist before marriage, then took a bit of a break when she had her children and retrained as a GP. And she recommended this phased model to aspiring female medics at this time. And indeed, this idea of working up until pregnancy, taking a break, and then coming back in and picking up the threads of a career becomes a pattern which many professional women increasingly adopt after the Second World War. And then finally, on the right, we've got the economist Joan Robinson, who became a very distinguished academic at the University of Cambridge, but who initially was a Don's wife. So she married a male fellow in the economics department, played the role of Don's wife and had 2 children. But what's quite interesting about her professional trajectory is that she delayed having children initially. I think she had them when she was about 30, then had them quite close together, and was able to employ a housekeeper and a nanny, and used the free time that she had as a leisured wife and then as a leisured mother to do her groundbreaking research. And she lived close to all the university libraries in Cambridge. She had access through her husband to the male networks of the economics faculty. And because her research turned out to be incredibly good and extremely groundbreaking, she was able eventually to establish herself in a permanent lectureship and then went on to have a very, very highly regarded career. Now, all these women, like Garrett Anderson, made their own childcare arrangements. They saw it as their own responsibility to find ways to fit careers around what was expected of them as wives of professional men and as mothers. And rather relevant to our own times, they all worked from home to a greater or lesser degree. So writing, academic work were activities which could often be done at a desk in a study at home. Many GPs actually, right until the later 20th century, located their surgeries inside their own homes. And I would argue that this was very important for professional working mothers, not just in terms of the practical flexibility that home working provided, but because it lowered women's visibility in the professional workplace. So men were not affronted by the presence of female competitors in the way that they might be in the boardroom or the courtroom or the hospital ward. And I'll just sort of reiterate again, these women were working from home, but they didn't have children underfoot. They weren't trying to supervise home learning, as so many of us have been doing in the last couple of months. They had nannies and governesses and boarding schools for that. And their work on the whole was clean and safe. And this is unlike the sweated labor that many poorer mothers were doing in their homes in this period, sewing shirt collars, mending sacks, assembling boxes, making artificial flowers, and so on, to earn a few extra shillings for the family. What we're seeing here, what I'm describing here, is very much the privileged face of homeworking. And it's also the racially privileged white face of professional working motherhood. All the women that I've mentioned so far are white, which reflects the racial privilege of whiteness historically. But I do want to mention one Black professional working mother who features in my book, Buchi Emecheta. She came to London in the 1960s and achieved quite a degree of literary success, beginning with two brilliant and heavily autobiographical novels, In the Ditch and Second Class Citizen. These novels tell the story of Ada, a young, clever, and ambitious Nigerian migrant who comes to Britain, as Emma Cheta did, in the 1960s. And Ada is very well educated. She had won a scholarship to a prestigious school in Lagos. And when she comes to London, she gets a good job as a librarian in a public library. But the overarching theme of both novels is Ada's struggle to assert her right to equal status and to resist the assumption that because she's Black and because she's a migrant, she can't expect to have the same opportunities either for herself or for her children that white Britons were increasingly coming to expect in the post-war decades, the era of affluence and the welfare state. And these novels provide a really eye-opening insight into the experiences of a clever, ambitious, talented Black woman trying to improve her situation and her family's situation in a very hostile white society. And then finally, I'm going to jump forward to the 1980s and thought that I would close with a legal example, the barrister Barbara Mills. And this is a rather grainy image, which I've taken from a book, Valerie Grove's The Complete Woman, Marriage, Motherhood, Career, Can She Have It All?, published in 1987. And this book was based on a collection of interviews which Grove conducted with high-achieving professional women who had 3 or more children. And the theme of these interviews and of the book as a whole is very much exemplary. You know, Grove is asking, how do they do it? What can we learn from their success? And the interview with Mills, I think, is very revealing. At this point in her career, she's still a barrister. She's just become a QC. It's before she moves into public service. Her children, who are pictured standing, grinning next to her, are all teenagers. And she describes in detail to Grove how she and her husband run the household together, how they plan their diaries, how they organize their meals, how she juggled studying and pupillage whilst having her babies. She mentions that she had her children in May or June because this fitted better with bar terms. How they turned the basement of their house into a nursery to solve the childcare problem, and then subsequently employed nannies and housekeepers. And there's a very strong focus throughout her testimony on just getting on with it, making things work, being resourceful, being resilient, and being determined. And at the very end of the interview, she says this: "Nobody has ever been able to say of me that I could not do something because of my children. I have made it my business to put in 105% of effort in this respect. You cannot fail to turn up in court because your child's not well. You can't bring a trial to a halt. I've hacked out an unusual role because there are not that many women at the bar with children. I think I may have contributed to a change in attitude. I hope I have. It cannot be said anymore that a woman will be needing time off for her children." Now, I got my undergraduates at Cambridge to read this, and they were actually pretty appalled at this suggestion that the solution for mothers is just to grit your teeth, get on with it, and fit in with the system, a system that, of course, was designed for men with non-working wives. They didn't admire Barbara Mills for her attitude at all, although as good historians, they also recognise that she was speaking at a very different time, over 30 years ago, in the era of Thatcherism. But in some ways, Mill's statement reminds us of how little we have travelled from this position, that mothers can, of course, pursue careers if they want to, but it's really up to them to make it work by using their wits and persevering. They can't expect employers or government or wider society to change. Now, of course, there have been changes in the professional workplace, particularly with more flexible working practices becoming common. And there has been a strengthening of rights concerning things like parental leave and protection against redundancy in pregnancy. But, and this is my concluding thought, the COVID-19 crisis has exposed just how precariously placed many working mothers still are. If you take away formal childcare by closing nurseries and schools, and if you take away access to informal networks of care and support, most crucially grandparents, the result is that women end up doing more unpaid work in the home and find themselves at greater risk of being furloughed or being asked to take unpaid leave, or in worst case scenario, being made unemployed. And we know from recent studies by the IFS and by the Women's Budget Group and others that this is happening, that the economic lockdown, the economic impact of the lockdown is hurting women more and is magnifying the pre-existing sexual divisions in the home. And it's interesting how this is affecting women that we might describe as elite women or privileged women of the professional middle classes that I focused on in my presentation. I should say my book, of course, is not just about these privileged middle-class professional women. I look at working mothers across the social spectrum, but I think it's very interesting the way that the COVID-19 crisis actually is impacting on gender equality across the board. Now, this is a rather depressing note on which to end, so I thought I would just leave you with one more of the images from my book, the wonderful cover of Nicola Horlick's 1997 memoir, Can You Have It All? Nicola Horlick was a very successful fund manager who in the 1990s had a large family. I think she had 5 children, but became both venerated and vilified in the press as Superwoman, as the woman who demonstrated that you could have a career and you could also have a fulfilling family life. And I just love this cover. I think, perhaps it was considered cutting edge cover design in the mid-1990s, but I think we certainly can analyze it now as a historical document. So I hope you enjoyed my talk. Just to remind you again, Double Lives is my book if you do find anything that I've talked about of interest. And thank you very much for listening.